So this is a story about a man whose name was Willie McCrae. Now, Willie McCrae was, wait, any McCrae's here? Oh, I mean, I heard a little gasp, so I thought maybe. Willie McCrae was a carpenter, and he was a very fine carpenter. He was also a shipbuilder and a ship mender, and he was so good at what he did that he was always busy, always busy, always busy, building little boats and mending boats. And you know, they have that expression that the cobbler's children go barefoot. Well, it was kind of like that with Willie McCrae. He had his own little boat, a little dinghy, and thanks to a wild wave and a sharp rock, there was a hole in the side. It had been sitting out in his yard for months and months and months while he worked on everybody else's boats. He just never had a chance to fix that dinghy. But one day he thought, I think I'm going to have a free afternoon. This is the day to fix my dinghy. So he went to his workroom, and there were all kinds of wood that he used to fix other people's boats. Long and short, and hickory and pine and oak, all kinds of pieces of wood. But he looked at them one at a time, and there wasn't a single piece that was the right length and the right girth to fix the hole in his dinghy. So he picked up his axe and he headed for the woods, looking for, well, he hoped a downed limb, but if not, he was willing to cut down a limb. And he walked and walked, looking for just the right piece of wood. And then something strange happened. This is Scotland, after all. And the sun started to set. It started to get dark, and the mist started to rise. And so there he was on the Scottish moors, mist, and he was completely lost. He had grown up in that area, and he thought he knew every inch of it like the back of his hand. But he didn't know where he was, and he didn't know how to get home. He looked around and he thought, well, I guess I'll just be sleeping under the trees on a pile of leaves tonight. And then he saw, in the distance, glimmering through the leaves, a light. You've heard that expression, go towards the light? Well, he decided to do that because he thought where there's a light, there are people, and when there are people, where there are people, there might be a bed for me to sleep on and maybe even a morsel to eat. So he headed for the light, and sure enough, in a place that he didn't remember there ever being any kind of a house, there was a small house. Windows were lighted up and there was smoke coming out of the chimney, and he knocked on the door. The door opened, and standing there in the doorway was an old woman. A really strange, weird old woman. She had a long black dress, she had gray hair, she had wrinkled skin. Anybody you know? And then he looked behind her, and standing behind that woman were two other women who looked enough like the first that he knew they must be sisters. So let's recap. We're on the Scottish moors, the mist is rising, and there are three weird sisters. Tragically, Willie McCrae was not familiar with Macbeth, as most of you probably are. And so they said, come in, oh, you look tired, and you must be hungry. We're just sitting down to eat. And they led him over to the table that was set for four, as though they'd been expecting him. Well, he sat down, and I told you he didn't know Macbeth, and so there were a lot of things that he didn't know about what he should be doing. But you know this, right? If you're ever in a strange situation with people or creatures that might have magic of some sort, never eat anything, right? I mean, remember poor Persephone. Look what happened to her. But he was hungry, and so he ate that bowl of soup that they presented him with, and because he was very hungry, when they offered him a second helping, he ate that as well. It was really delicious. Spice was sort of unusual, but it tasted very good. And then he felt unaccountably, extremely weary. He yawned, and they said, oh, you must stay here for the night. We'll show you to the guest room. And they showed him into an adjoining room, and it was all made up as though they'd been expecting him. It was very sparsely furnished. There was just a bed and a chest at the end of the bed, a little table, a chair, a fireplace. And he sat down, and then he lay down, and he didn't remember the other big rule. Never go to sleep. Remember Invasion of the Body Snatchers. He didn't know about that any more than he knew about Macbeth. But he was so tired that he fell almost instantly into a deep, deep sleep. And he only awoke when he heard a slight creaking of the door, and he peered just through a slit in his eyes, and he saw the first of those old women. She tiptoed into the room, over to the trunk at the foot of the bed. She lifted the lid, reached inside, pulled out a red cap, put it on her head, raised her hand and said, "Here's off to London," and whoosh, she was gone, up the chimney. That was strange. But he thought maybe he had just imagined it. After all, he'd been fast asleep. So he tried to get back to sleep, but then he heard another creaking of the door, and sure enough, in came the second of those old women. She went to the foot of the bed, she opened up the chest, she reached inside, pulled out a red cap, put it on her head, lifted her arm and said, "Here's off to London," and whoosh, she was gone. Well, now, he just waited for the other shoe to drop, right? He didn't pretend to be asleep, but just looked. And sure enough, the door opened and there was the third old woman. Yep, the trunk, the lid, the red cap, "Here's off to London," whoosh, she was gone. Well, now he didn't have to pretend at all. The women were all gone, and so he sat up in bed and thought what he should do, and I bet you know what he did. Yeah, he got up, he walked over to that chest, he lifted up the lid, he looked inside, and it was completely empty, except for one red cap. It was as though they'd been expecting him. And so he put that red cap on his head, he raised his hand and he said, "Here's off to London," and whoosh! Oh, soon he was flying through the air so high and so fast that he had to close his eyes. And then after, he didn't know if it was a long time or a short time, but he landed with a thump. And when he opened his eyes, he looked around and he thought, well, I have never been to London before, but this sure looks like London to me. And he found himself standing right in front of a pub. And for some reason, he felt at that moment that he really, really needed a drink. And so he went into the pub and he approached the barmaid to order a drink, and then he looked around and he saw on a table in the corner those three old women. They beckoned him over. There was an extra chair as though they'd been expecting him, but he stayed right there at the bar. He drank that drink and he ordered another, and then it was kind of a blur. And then after some time, long time or short time, it would be hard to know, he could see those women in the corner. He couldn't hear them, but he saw each of them pull out that red cap, put it on their head, and he could read their lips, and they were saying, "Here's off back to Kintail," which is where they'd come from, and whoosh, they were gone. Well, he thought, maybe that was a signal, and so he reached for his own red cap that he'd stuck in his belt, but then a couple of things happened right away. A little yellow dog that had been dozing behind the bar ran up, grabbed the red cap, and ran out the door. And the barmaid came over with a check. Well, he looked at that, and sure enough, there was his drink and a couple more, and then a few more after that. It looked like at some point he treated the entire pub. Well, it was quite a sum, and more than just an evening of dishwashing would take care of. And then he remembered that when he left that morning, he had left with a hatchet and no money. He wasn't planning on shopping or drinking or going to London or any of that. And he tried to explain that to the barmaid, but she was having none of it. She called the manager called the owner called the authorities, and Willie McCrae was arrested and put in jail. Now, you know that these days in the American judicial system, those things can hang on for weeks and months and years. Nope, not then and not there. The very next day, there was a trial. Willie McCrae was up on charges of not only avoiding paying a legitimate bill, but also maybe some witchcraft, you know? And so he was declared guilty and sentenced to hang. Well, as I said, no protracted legal things and no appeals of any sort. So that night, Willie McCrae could hear hammering outside, and he knew that they were erecting a scaffold, and that was going to be where he had his last moments. Sure enough, next morning they led him out of that jail cell, up those steps, and there was the hangman, and there was the noose. And the hangman put the noose over his neck and said, I guess he was required to say this, but he said, "Any last wishes?" Well, Willie McCrae looked around. There was a huge crowd. Apparently it was kind of a slow day in that part of London, or maybe it was always a slow day in that part of London, I don't know. Or maybe everybody was just excited about a hanging. Anyway, it was a huge crowd. But as he surveyed the crowd, right in front he saw a little boy. And next to that little boy he saw a yellow dog, and in that yellow dog's jaws was that red cap. He said, yeah, my last request is that I want to be hanged with that red cap on my head. That's strange, said the hangman. But he walked down those steps and he talked to the boy, and well, he got the cap. Walked back up, put that red cap on Willie's head and said, so, do you have any last words? And he said, why, yes, I do. Here's off to Kintail, and whoosh, he was gone. Now, in that neighborhood in London, people were talking for days and weeks about the man who had been sentenced to die and had somehow escaped. No one knew exactly how. But back in the woods near Kintail, Willie landed with a thump, and he looked around, no miss that day, and he thought, I think if I just follow that path, I'll get home. What was that? And he thought for a minute that it must have just been a dream. But then he reached up and he felt, oh yeah, that noose was still around his neck. And at the end of that rope, it was still attached to part of that scaffold. He looked at that piece of wood and he realized that it was exactly the right length and the girth to fix the hole in his dinghy. And so that is exactly what he did.